The machines stopped beeping at 11:47 p.m. And Marcus Chen knew he was about to witness something that would haunt him forever. He stood frozen in the doorway of the private hospital room, his janitor's cart forgotten behind him, watching as the most powerful woman in Silicon Valley took what might be her final breaths, completely alone. Victoria Sterling, the tech billionaire worth $43 billion, lay unconscious in the sterile hospital bed, her usually commanding presence reduced to the fragile rise and fall of her chest. The ventilator that had been sustaining her for 3 days had just been disconnected per her living will, and the cardiac monitor showed her heart struggling with each irregular beat. Outside in the hallway, Marcus could hear the click of expensive heels, retreating her own family walking away, leaving her to die in solitude. But Marcus couldn't move. Something deep in his chest, something that had nothing to do with his minimum wage job or his fear of wealthy people, rooted his feet to the floor. This woman, who owned half the buildings in the city, who employed thousands, who appeared on magazine covers as the epitome of success and power, was about to leave this world with no one holding her hand, no one to whisper that she mattered, no one to fight for her when she could no longer fight for herself. The heart monitor's rhythm grew more erratic. Her breathing became shallow, labored. And in that moment, Marcus Chen, single father, night shift cleaner, a man whose society barely acknowledged existed, made a decision that would shatter both their worlds and rebuild them into something neither could have imagined. He dropped his mop, stepped into the room, and closed the door behind him with quiet determination. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. I will protect her, he whispered into the darkness, not knowing that those 4 words would change everything. If you're already gripped by this story of courage against impossible odds, hit that like button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. This is a story about what happens when someone society overlooks becomes the only person standing between life and death. And you won't want to miss where it goes. The fluorescent lights in St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital cast harsh shadows down the sterile corridors at midnight. But Marcus Chen had grown accustomed to working in the spaces between light and dark. At 32, he moved through the hospital's halls like a ghost seen by the machines he cleaned around, invisible to the people who mattered. His worn sneakers made no sound against the polished linoleum. As he pushed his cart past room after room of sleeping patients, each one surrounded by more medical equipment than he could afford in a lifetime. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that seemed to vibrate through the walls themselves. Earlier that evening, the entire 7th floor had been cleared, except for one room, the VIP suite, at the end of the hall. Security guards had been stationed at every elevator and stairwell, their earpieces crackling with constant communication. Nurses whispered in tight clusters, their voices carrying fragments that made Marcus's stomach tighten. Family meeting. Disconnecting life support. Disconnecting. The biggest inheritance battle in California history. Marcus knew who was in that room. Everyone in the city knew. Victoria Sterling, the woman who had built Nexus Technologies from a garage startup into a $43 billion empire, had collapsed during a board meeting 6 days ago. A massive stroke, the news had reported. Touch and go. Family gathered. The usual phrases that meant someone powerful was dying and the world was watching. But as Marcus approached the VIP wing to begin his nightly cleaning routine, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The hallway was empty. No security guards. No family members camped out in the waiting area. No army of assistants coordinating media statements. Just silence, broken only by the distant hum of medical equipment and his own careful footsteps. He paused outside room 712. the only door that mattered tonight. Through the thin crack beneath it, he could see light, not the warm glow of bedside lamps, but the clinical blue-white of monitors and life-support machines. He pressed his ear to the door and heard voices, sharp and businesslike. "The will is clear, Charles. Everything goes to the foundation if there's no immediate family to claim it. She has no children, remember? Her sister died 10 years ago. There's literally no one left, except us, and we're not blood relatives. We can't inherit under the terms she set up, which means the entire $43 billion goes to charity. $43 billion gone." Just like that, Marcus heard the scrape of chairs, the rustle of expensive clothing, the click of briefcases snapping shut. The voices were moving toward the door. "So we're really doing this?" A woman's voice, thin and uncertain. "The living will is explicit," came the reply, cold and final. "No extraordinary measures. She's been brain dead for 3 days. It's time, but she's still breathing on her own. Not for much longer. The doctors said once we remove the ventilator, it's a matter of hours, maybe less." Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. He quickly moved his cart away from the door, pretending to clean the drinking fountain as the door opened and 4 people emerged. He recognized them from the business magazines that sometimes lay discarded in the hospital break room. Victoria's nephew Charles, her former business partner Robert, and 2 lawyers whose names he didn't know but whose expressions he understood perfectly. They looked like people who had just made a calculated decision, not a heartbroken one. Charles Sterling, a thin man with prematurely gray hair and cold blue eyes, glanced at his expensive watch. "The ventilator comes off in 10 minutes. I'll handle the media statement from the hotel. The funeral arrangements are already in place." "What about the employees?" Robert asked. "Nexus has 60,000 people. They'll want to know." "They'll know what we tell them," Charles replied curtly. Victoria Sterling died peacefully, surrounded by family. End of story. Marcus bent lower over the drinking fountain, his hands shaking as he sprayed cleaner that he didn't need to use, surrounded by family. But here they were, walking away, leaving her to die alone, while they managed the optics and calculated their losses. As their voices faded down the hallway toward the elevator, Marcus remained frozen by the fountain, his mind reeling. He had cleaned around enough deathbeds to recognize the signs, families who stayed, holding hands and whispering love into the darkness, and families who left, unable to watch or unwilling to care. But this felt different. This felt like abandonment so complete it made his chest ache. The elevator dinged, doors closed. Silence returned. Marcus straightened slowly, his janitor's uniform suddenly feeling heavier than usual. He looked down the empty hallway, then back at room 712. Behind that door, the most powerful woman in the world was about to face the most powerless moment of any human life. And she was going to face it completely alone. He thought about his own daughter, Emma, asleep in their tiny apartment, 20 miles away. What if it were her in that room someday? What if she were dying, and everyone who was supposed to love her just walked away? Marcus had spent his entire adult life invisible to people like Victoria Sterling. He cleaned the offices where they made million-dollar deals. He emptied trash cans filled with papers that represented more money than he would see in 10 lifetimes. He was part of the infrastructure that kept their world running smoothly. But he was never supposed to matter. Tonight, though, maybe not mattering, was exactly what mattered most. He abandoned his cart in the hallway and walked to the door of room 712. His hand hovered over the handle for a long moment, his mind racing through all the reasons this was a terrible idea. He could lose his job. He could face charges for trespassing in a private room. He could be arrested, sued, destroyed by people with more power than he could comprehend. But through the door, He could hear it, the steady beep of monitors, the mechanical whisper of the ventilator, and underneath it all, the sound of someone dying alone. Marcus turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was a temple to wealth and medical technology. Flowers covered every available surface arrangements that probably cost more than his monthly rent. The bed was surrounded by machines he couldn't even name, their screens flickering with numbers and waves that meant life or death. And in the center of it all, Victoria Sterling lay unconscious, her face pale but peaceful, her chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. She looked smaller than he had expected. In the business magazines, she always appeared commanding, fierce, invincible, but here, with tubes and wires connecting her to the machines that kept her alive, she looked like what she was, a human being in need of help. Marcus approached the bed carefully, his sneakers silent on the polished floor. Up close, he could see the family resemblance to Charles, the same strong jawline, the same aristocratic nose. But where Charles's face had been cold and calculating, hers held a softness that sleep had revealed. She looked like someone who had fought hard for everything she had built, and who was now too tired to fight anymore. "I'm sorry they left you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the machines. "Nobody should have to do this alone." As if in response, one of the monitors began beeping more urgently. Marcus looked up at the screen, not understanding the numbers but recognizing the change in rhythm. Something was happening. A nurse appeared in the doorway, her face curious but not alarmed. "Excuse me! You can't be in here. This is a private room." Marcus turned to face her, his heart pounding. The lie came so easily it surprised him. But looking at Victoria Sterling, surrounded by evidence of wealth that had apparently bought her everything except loyalty, it didn't feel like a lie anymore. The nurse glanced at her clipboard. "I'm sorry, but there are no visitors listed except for immediate family, and they've all left for the evening." "They left?" Marcus asked, letting genuine shock color his voice. "But the family requested privacy during this time," the nurse said gently. "The ventilator is being removed in a few minutes, per her living will. If you'd like to wait in the family room, e.com. "No," Marcus said firmly, surprising himself with his own boldness. "I'd like to stay. If that's allowed." The nurse studied him for a moment, taking in his janitor's uniform, his work-worn hands, his earnest expression. She glanced back at Victoria, then at the empty chairs where family should have been sitting. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "It might be difficult to watch." Marcus looked back at Victoria Sterling, this woman he had never spoken to, but whose life had somehow become connected to his in this moment. "She shouldn't be alone," he said simply. The nurse nodded slowly. "I'll let Dr. Martinez know there's someone with her. He'll be in shortly, too, to begin the process." When she left, Marcus pulled one of the chairs closer to the bed and sat down. He had no idea what he was supposed to do, what he was supposed to say to someone who might not be able to hear him anyway. But he reached out tentatively and placed his calloused hand over her smooth one. "My name is Marcus," he said softly. "I work here, nights, cleaning. I know you don't know me, but I've heard about you, about the things you built, the people you employed, the scholarships you funded. I think you did good things with your life." The ventilator wheezed softly, pushing air into her lungs with mechanical consistency. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "I have a daughter," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "Emma. She's 8. Sometimes when I'm here at night, cleaning the offices on the business floors, I see the pictures in the magazines. You starting your company, building it up, being the only woman in all those boardrooms full of men. I always thought if Emma grows up to be half as strong as you seem to be, she'd do okay." Dr. Martinez entered the room, a solemn man in his 50s with kind eyes and tired shoulders. He looked surprised to see Marcus, but didn't ask him to leave. "You're here for Miss Sterling?" he asked. Marcus nodded. I'm her friend." It was becoming easier to say, and somehow more true with each repetition. "Doctor." Martinez moved to the ventilator, his hands gentle but efficient as he began checking settings. "I need you to know that once we remove the ventilator, there may be some discomfort, some distress. It's not always peaceful, despite what people think." "I understand," Marcus said, though he didn't really understand anything about what was happening. He only knew that Victoria Sterling deserved to have someone there who cared about her as a person, not as a $43 billion estate. "Her family couldn't stay, Doctor?" Martinez asked as he made notations on his tablet. Marcus's jaw tightened. The doctor's expression darkened slightly, but he said nothing. He had seen enough wealthy families to understand the implication. "All right, Doctor," Martinez said finally. "I'm going to reduce the ventilator support gradually. Let her body take over naturally. It could be minutes, or it could be hours. There's no way to know." Marcus squeezed Victoria's hand again. "I'm not going anywhere." Dr. Martinez began the process, adjusting dials and switches with practiced care. The rhythm of the ventilator changed, became less frequent. On the monitors, numbers began to shift. And slowly, gradually, Victoria Sterling began to breathe on her own. The first hour passed in silence, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor and Victoria's increasingly labored breathing. Marcus stayed in his chair, holding her hand, occasionally speaking to her about Emma, about his work, about anything that came to mind. He told her about the sunrise he watched every morning when his shift ended, about the book Emma was reading for school, about the small victories that made up a life lived without billions of dollars. During the second hour, her breathing became more irregular. The spaces between breaths grew longer, and Marcus found himself holding his own breath until she took the next one. "Doctor." Martinez checked on them twice, each time looking surprised but pleased that Marcus was still there. It was during the third hour, as the clock approached 3 a.m., that Victoria's eyes fluttered open. Marcus nearly jumped out of his chair. Her gaze was unfocused at first, confused, but gradually her eyes found his face. "Who?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus leaned forward, his heart racing. "I'm Marcus. I'm here with you." She studied his face for a long moment, her breathing shallow but steady. "My family?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Marcus looked into her eyes, intelligent, aware, afraid, and made a choice that would change both their lives forever. "I'm here," he said simply. "You're not alone." Something shifted in her expression. Not relief, exactly, but recognition. She understood that her family had left, and she understood that this stranger had stayed. Her fingers, weak but determined, tightened around his. "Thank you," she whispered. And in that moment, Marcus Chen knew that protecting Victoria Sterling had become more than a decision. It had become his mission. Whatever happened next, whatever forces tried to tear apart what was left of her life, he would be the one person who refused to walk away. The machines continued their quiet chorus around them. And Victoria Sterling, dying billionaire and abandoned daughter, closed her eyes again, secure in the knowledge that someone was fighting for her. Someone who had absolutely nothing to gain and everything to lose. Someone who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing in the world is simply refusing to leave. Victoria Sterling's eyes opened again at dawn, and this time they stayed open. The machines around her bed hummed with quiet efficiency, but the ventilator that had been breathing for her 3 days ago was gone. She was alive, breathing on her own, and staring at a man she had never seen before, who was slumped in the chair beside her bed, still holding her hand. Marcus had dozed off sometime around 4 a.m., his head tilted back against the chair, his work uniform wrinkled from the long night. In the morning light streaming through the hospital windows, Victoria could see him clearly for the first time. The calloused hands that spoke of physical labor, the worn fabric of his janitor's uniform, the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that needed cutting, and the kind of lean build that came from hard work rather than expensive gyms. She studied his face with the analytical mind that had built her empire. This was not a man who belonged in her world. His shoes were scuffed, his watch was plastic, and there was a small tear in the shoulder of his uniform shirt that had been carefully mended with nearly invisible stitches. But his hand was warm over hers, and when she squeezed his fingers, he woke immediately with the alertness of someone accustomed to being needed. "You're awake," he said, sitting up straighter. His voice was rough with sleep but gentle. "How do you feel?" Victoria tried to speak and found her throat raw from the tubes that had been removed. Marcus reached for the water cup on the bedside table, carefully helping her take small sips through a straw. "Better," she managed finally. "You stayed all night." It wasn't a question. She remembered fragments his voice telling her stories about his daughter. His hand never leaving hers. The quiet presence that had anchored her during the long hours when consciousness drifted in and out like tide. "I said I would protect you," Marcus replied simply. Victoria's memory was fuzzy, but she remembered that voice cutting through the darkness, the conviction in those words. She also remembered the sound of expensive shoes clicking away from her room, the low voices of her nephew and business partners discussing her death like a quarterly earnings report. "My family," she said, the words bitter on her tongue. Marcus's expression tightened. "They left. Last night. Before the doctors removed the ventilator. They thought you wouldn't wake up, and you stayed with someone you'd never met." "Yes, ma'am." Victoria studied his face again, searching for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden agenda that had to be there. In her world, nobody did anything without expecting something in return. But Marcus Chen's dark eyes held only concern, and a stubborn kind of loyalty that she hadn't seen in decades. "Why?" she asked. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. "My wife died 3 years ago," he said finally. "Cancer. At the end, when the treatments stopped working, her family, they couldn't handle it. They loved her, but they couldn't watch her die. So, it was just me and Emma, that's my daughter, sitting with her in hospice. And I remember thinking that if this ever happened to Emma, if she was alone and scared and nobody came, I'd want someone to stay. Even a stranger. Especially a stranger, maybe, because strangers don't have agendas." Victoria felt something crack open in her chest. "I'm sorry about your wife." "Thank you. She would have liked you, I think. She always said the world needed more women who weren't afraid to take up space." Before Victoria could respond, the door burst open, and Dr. Martinez rushed in, followed by 2 nurses. His face was a mixture of amazement and professional concern. "Miss Sterling, this is remarkable. Your brain activity, your motor responses, you've made an extraordinary recovery." He began checking her pupils with a small flashlight. "We need to run some tests, but preliminary observations suggest minimal cognitive impairment from the stroke. It's almost unprecedented for someone in your condition." As the medical team bustled around her bed, Victoria kept her eyes on Marcus. He had stood when the doctor entered, backing away to give them room to work, but he hadn't left. He waited by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, ready to resume his vigil if needed. "Doctor," Victoria said, her voice growing stronger, "I'd like Mr. Chen to stay during the examination." Dr. Martinez looked surprised. "Are you family, Mr. Chen?" Marcus hesitated, glancing at Victoria. She gave him the slightest nod. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of tests and examinations. Victoria's recovery was indeed remarkable. Minimal paralysis, clear speech, intact memory. The stroke had been massive, Dr. Martinez explained, but somehow her brain had found ways to reroute around the damaged areas. It would take months of physical therapy to regain full strength, but she was going to live. She was going to be herself. Through it all, Marcus stayed. When the physical therapist came to assess Victoria's mobility, he stood quietly in the corner. When the neurologist tested her cognitive functions, he waited in the hallway. When the social worker arrived to discuss discharge planning, he was there to listen and ask the practical questions that Victoria, still weak and overwhelmed, couldn't think to ask. It was during one of these sessions that Victoria learned more about the man who had appointed himself her guardian, Marcus Chen, 32 years old, widower, father of 8-year-old Emma. He worked the night shift at St. Catherine's Hospital, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 days a week. Before that, he had worked day shifts at an office building downtown. The same building, Victoria realized with a start, that housed 3 of her subsidiary companies. "Wait," she said when he mentioned the address. "Meridian Tower?" Marcus nodded. "Floors 12 through 15. I cleaned there for about 2 years. My companies lease 4 floors in that building. You might have cleaned my offices." "Probably." "I cleaned everyone's offices. Most people don't really see the cleaning staff." Victoria felt another crack in her chest. How many nights had this man emptied her trash, cleaned her conference room, restocked her supply closets, while she worked late on deals worth millions? How many times had she walked past him without acknowledgement, too focused on her empire to notice the people who kept it running? "You left that job to come here?" she asked. "The pay was better here," Marcus said simply. "And the hours work better with Emma's school schedule. I drop her off in the morning after my shift, sleep while she's in class, pick her up in the afternoon. We have dinner together. I help her with homework. Then Mrs. Rodriguez next door watches her while I'm at work." It was a life Victoria could barely imagine. Every decision driven by necessity. Every hour carefully calculated to provide for a child while earning just enough to survive. She had employees who lived lives like this, thousands of them, but she had never really considered the intricate choreography required to make it work. "How long has it been since you've been home?" she asked. Marcus checked his plastic watch. "About 14 hours. Emma must be worried. I called Mrs. Rodriguez this morning. Told her I was helping a friend. Emma knows sometimes work keeps me late." The casual way he referred to her as a friend made Victoria's throat tighten. When was the last time anyone had considered her a friend rather than a business contact? A networking opportunity, or a stepping stone to something bigger? Her phone, which had been charging on the bedside table, began buzzing insistently. The screen showed dozens of missed calls and text messages. Charles, Robert, her assistant, the board of directors, the media. "I should probably," Victoria began, reaching for the phone. "No," Marcus said firmly. "Not yet. You just woke up from a coma yesterday. The business can wait one more day." Victoria stared at him. No one had told her no in years. CEOs, politicians, investors, they all wanted her attention, her approval, her money. But this janitor, this single father who had stayed by her bedside all night, was telling her to rest. "My nephew Charles," she said slowly. "He's probably already begun the process to have me declared incompetent, to take control of the company." Marcus's expression darkened. "The man who left you alone last night?" "The same one. He's next in line if something happens to me." He's been waiting for this opportunity for years. Then we make sure he doesn't get it, Marcus said simply. The word we hung in the air between them. Victoria had built her empire alone, trusting only herself, learning early that everyone had a price. But looking at Marcus, this man who had everything to lose and nothing to gain from protecting her, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. The desire to trust someone completely. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Marcus sat back down in the chair beside her bed. "I know you employed 60,000 people. I know you started your company with nothing and built something that changed the world. I know that when you were dying, nobody who shared your blood cared enough to hold your hand. And I know that my daughter is going to grow up in a world that you helped shape. So yeah, I think it matters whether good people or bad people control the things that Emma's generation inherits." Victoria closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle back onto her shoulders. She had fought so hard to build Nexus Technologies, to prove that a woman could compete with the titans of Silicon Valley. But in the process, she had lost touch with the human cost of that fight. The employees who worked long hours for modest pay, the families like Marcus's who lived one emergency away from disaster. "If I fight Charles," she said quietly, "it's going to get ugly. He has lawyers, political connections, media contacts. He'll use everything he can against me, including the fact that I'm not fully recovered yet." "What will he use against me?" Marcus asked. Victoria opened her eyes and looked at him. "Against you? I'm nobody," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "I don't have money, or connections, or secrets to hide. The worst thing anyone can say about me is that I care too much about people I don't know. If that's a weakness, I'll take it." In that moment, Victoria Sterling, billionaire, CEO, tech pioneer, one of the most powerful women in the world, realized she had just found something more valuable than all her wealth, an ally who couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and couldn't be turned against her, because his loyalty wasn't based on what she could give him. It was based on who she was when everything else was stripped away. "All right," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Let's fight." Marcus squeezed her hand. Together, outside her hospital room, the world was already spinning stories about Victoria Sterling's miraculous recovery and mysterious absence from public view. Charles Sterling was scheduling emergency board meetings. Reporters were camping outside the hospital. Stock prices were fluctuating based on rumors and speculation. But inside room 712, a billionaire and a janitor were planning a battle that would determine not just who controlled a $43 billion empire, but what kind of world they wanted to leave for the next generation. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first move came sooner than they expected. Victoria's phone rang again, and this time the caller ID made her stomach clench. Charles Sterling, calling from the office that had been hers for 15 years. She looked at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "Time to let them know I'm not dead yet," Victoria said, and answered the call. "Hello, Charles." The silence on the other end was long enough to be satisfying. "Victoria?" Charles's voice was strangled. "But?" The doctors said. "The doctors were wrong," Victoria said calmly. "I'm very much alive, and I'm very interested in hearing about these emergency board meetings you've been scheduling." Another long pause. Then Charles's voice, colder now. "We need to talk. In person. Tonight." "No," Victoria said, looking directly at Marcus. "We don't. But I'll see you tomorrow morning. In my office. With my lawyer present." "Victoria, you've been in a coma for days. You can't just—" "Watch me," Victoria said, and hung up. Marcus was grinning. I think you're going to be just fine. But Victoria knew Charles wouldn't give up easily. The real battle was just beginning, and before it was over, Marcus Chen, the invisible man who had refused to let her die alone, was going to discover that protecting a billionaire from her own family would require more courage than either of them knew he possessed. The war for Victoria Sterling's empire was about to begin, and the most unlikely alliance in corporate history was about to face its first real test. The call came at 2:47 a.m., 3 weeks after Victoria had left the hospital. Marcus jolted awake in his small apartment, his hand instinctively reaching for the phone beside his bed. Emma stirred in the next room, but didn't wake. On the screen, Victoria Sterling. Marcus? Her voice was tight with fear. They're here. Charles brought security guards. They're trying to force me out of my own home. Marcus was already pulling on his clothes. Are you safe right now? I'm locked in my office, but they're demanding I come out and sign papers. Charles is saying I'm mentally incompetent, that the stroke damaged my judgment. He has some doctor with him, claiming I need to be placed under conservatorship. Through the phone, Marcus could hear pounding on a door. Raised voices. The authoritative tone of Charles Sterling demanding entry. I'm coming, Marcus said, grabbing his keys. Don't sign anything. Don't open that door. Marcus? You can't. This is my fight, and if you get involved, Charles will destroy you. He already knows about you, about us. He's been having me watched. Marcus paused, his hand on the apartment door. In the 3 weeks since Victoria's recovery, their unlikely friendship had deepened into something neither of them had expected. She had insisted on paying for Emma's after-school program, claiming it was the least she could do for the man who had saved her life. But it was more than gratitude. They had discovered a connection that transcended the vast differences in their circumstances. Two people who understood what it meant to fight for what mattered, no matter the cost. What did Charles find out? Marcus asked. Everything. Your financial situation, your work history, Emma's school records. He's threatening to call Child Protective Services, claiming that your association with me proves you're an unfit parent, seeking to exploit a vulnerable elderly woman. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach. Emma has nothing to do with this. He knows that. He's using her to get to you, to get to me. If you come here tonight, he'll claim it proves his point that you're manipulating me for money. The pounding in the background grew louder. Charles's voice rose. Victoria, this is ridiculous. Open this door immediately, or I'm having the guards break it down. I don't care what he claims, Marcus said firmly, already heading for the stairs. Nobody threatens my daughter, and nobody abandons their family when they need help most. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Marcus. 20 minutes, he repeated, and hung up. Mrs. Rodriguez answered her door in her bathrobe, instantly alert when she saw Marcus's face. Emergency? She asked simply. Yes. I don't know how long I'll be gone. Could be hours. Go, Mrs. Rodriguez said, already moving toward his apartment to check on Emma. We'll be fine. Marcus drove through the empty city streets with a clarity he hadn't felt since the night he'd found Victoria dying alone. This wasn't about money, or power, or business empires. This was about the same thing it had always been about. Refusing to let someone face their darkest moment without an ally. Victoria Sterling's mansion sat on 2 acres in the most exclusive neighborhood in the city. But tonight, it looked like a fortress under siege. Black SUVs blocked the circular driveway. Men in suits stood at strategic positions around the grounds, their earpieces glowing in the darkness. Through the tall windows, Marcus could see figures moving in the main hallway. He parked on the street and walked through the front gate, which had been left open. A security guard immediately stepped into his path. Sir, this is private property. You need to leave." "I'm here to see Victoria Sterling," Marcus said calmly. "Miss Sterling is unavailable. She's meeting with family about important health decisions." Marcus looked past the guard toward the house, where he could see Charles Sterling gesturing animatedly at a group of men in suits. "Health decisions that require armed security?" The guard's hand moved to his radio. "Sir, I'm asking you to leave voluntarily." "And I'm asking you to step aside," Marcus replied, his voice steady, but carrying a hint of the steel that had kept him working 2 jobs for 3 years without breaking. "Because that woman in there saved my family when we had nothing. And I'm not walking away from her. Now." Before the guard could respond, the front door of the mansion opened, and Charles Sterling emerged, flanked by 2 lawyers and a man in a white coat, who was presumably the doctor. "Mr. Chen," Charles said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "How convenient. You've saved me the trouble of having you summoned." Marcus studied Victoria's nephew in person for the first time. Charles was probably 50, with the kind of soft edges that came from inherited wealth, and the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than effort. "Where's Victoria?" Marcus asked. "Miss Sterling is indisposed," the doctor replied smoothly. "I'm Dr. Hendricks. I've been treating her since her stroke, and it's my professional opinion that she's not capable of making sound financial or legal decisions at this time." Marcus looked at the man's expensive suit, his perfectly styled hair, his manicured nails. Funny. The doctors at St. Catherine's said she made a full recovery. Hospital doctors often lack the specialized expertise to properly assess cognitive function after traumatic brain injury. "Doctor?" Hendricks said dismissively. "Miss Sterling is exhibiting classic signs of impaired judgment, forming inappropriate attachments, making erratic financial decisions, displaying paranoid behaviors." "Like what?" Marcus asked. Charles stepped forward. "Like giving expensive gifts to hospital employees. Like claiming her own family abandoned her. Like insisting that a janitor be present during confidential medical consultations." "A janitor who saved her life," Marcus said quietly. "A janitor who's clearly recognized an opportunity," Charles shot back. "Come now, Mr. Chen. A single father, struggling financially, befriends a vulnerable billionaire in a hospital? The optics alone suggest exploitation." Marcus felt the familiar sensation of being invisible, dismissed, treated as less than by people who had never worked a day of physical labor in their lives. But this time, instead of shrinking back, he stepped forward. "The optics suggest," Marcus said clearly, "that when your aunt was dying, you left her alone to plan her funeral while I stayed to hold her hand. Everything that's happened since then has been her choice, made with a clear mind and a grateful heart." Charles's expression hardened. "Dr. Hendricks has prepared a comprehensive psychological evaluation. The courts will see that Victoria's judgment has been severely compromised by her medical trauma, and that she's fallen victim to a sophisticated manipulation scheme." "Manipulation?" Marcus almost laughed. "What exactly do you think I've gained from this? 3 weeks of private access to one of the wealthiest women in America," one of the lawyers interjected. "Plenty of time to influence her thinking, to position yourself for significant financial benefit." Marcus looked around at the assembled group, the lawyers, the security guards, the doctor with his convenient diagnosis. All of them paid to be there. All of them with something to gain from Victoria's diminished capacity. "You want to know what I've gained?" Marcus said, his voice carrying across the circular driveway. "I've gained a friend. Someone who asks about my daughter's homework. Someone who understands that work is about more than profit margins, it's about dignity. Someone who reminds me that there are still people in this world who care about doing the right thing, even when it costs them." He turned his attention to Dr. Hendricks. "And you want to know what's inappropriate about my relationship with Victoria Sterling?" The fact that it took a stroke for someone to treat her like a human being instead of a walking bank account. Charles's face flushed red. You, self-righteous. Enough. The voice came from the second-floor balcony. Victoria Sterling stood there in a dark robe, her posture straight, despite the walker she leaned on for support. Even from a distance, even weakened by her ordeal, she commanded attention in a way that made every person in the driveway look up. "Charles," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had built a $43 billion empire. "You will remove your security team from my property immediately." "Victoria, be reasonable," Charles called up. "You're not well. Dr. Hendricks is here to help." "Dr. Hendricks is here because you paid him to be here," Victoria replied coldly. "Just like those lawyers, just like those guards. Everyone here is being compensated for their loyalty, except the one person who's earned it." She began making her way carefully down the exterior staircase, her movements slow but determined. Marcus moved instinctively toward the stairs, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I can manage," she said firmly. "I want everyone here to see that I can manage." It took her several minutes to descend the stairs, but she did it alone, with a dignity that made Charles's claims of incompetence look absurd. When she reached the driveway, she positioned herself directly between Marcus and her nephew. "Now," she said, her voice steady and clear, "let me address your concerns about my mental capacity." Dr. Hendricks stepped forward with his tablet. "Miss Sterling, perhaps we could discuss this privately." "No." Victoria cut him off. "You've made your evaluation public by bringing it to my home with an armed escort. We'll discuss it publicly." She turned to face Charles directly. "You believe I'm mentally incompetent because I've chosen to befriend someone outside our social circle, because I've shown gratitude to someone who showed me kindness, because I've questioned business practices that prioritize profit over people." "Victoria," Charles began. "I'm not finished," she said sharply. "For 30 years, I built Nexus Technologies by making hard decisions, calculated risks, strategic alliances. I've negotiated billion-dollar deals, managed 60,000 employees, and earned the respect of competitors who would have loved to see me fail." She paused, looking around at the assembled group. "But the smartest decision I've made in years was trusting a man who had absolutely nothing to gain by caring about me. A man who saw me as a human being when my own family saw me as a balance sheet." Dr. Hendricks cleared his throat. "Miss Sterling, trauma can affect judgment in ways that aren't immediately apparent." "Doctor," Victoria said, turning her full attention to him, "what's your assessment based on? Have you observed me in business meetings? Have you seen me review financial statements? Have you witnessed my interactions with employees, investors, or board members?" Dr. Hendricks hesitated. "I've based my evaluation on the reports provided by your family and the behavioral patterns they've described. Behavioral patterns such as forming inappropriate attachments to service workers, making erratic financial gifts, displaying paranoid suspicions about family members." "So your professional opinion," Victoria said slowly, "is based entirely on second-hand accounts from people who have a vested interest in having me declared incompetent?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus watched Victoria systematically dismantle the case against her competency with the same precision she had probably used in boardrooms for decades. But more than that, he watched her fight for their friendship, with a fierce protectiveness that made his chest tight with emotion. "Charles," Victoria said, finally, turning back to her nephew, "I'm going to make this very simple for you. You have 60 seconds to remove your people from my property, or I'm calling the police to have you arrested for trespassing and attempted coercion of a vulnerable adult." Charles's composure finally cracked. "You can't be serious. I'm your family. I'm trying to protect you from this opportunist." "This opportunist," Victoria said, her voice rising. Sat by my bedside when I was dying, while you were in the hotel planning my funeral. This opportunist has never asked me for a single thing except the right to be my friend. This opportunist works 16-hour days to provide for his daughter, while you've spent your entire adult life living off the success I built. She took a step closer to Charles, and despite her need for the walker, she somehow seemed to tower over him. You want to know what damaged judgment looks like? She continued. It's spending 60 years of my life trying to earn the love of a family that only valued me for what I could give them. It's believing that blood meant more than character. It's trusting people who shared my DNA, more than people who shared my values. Marcus felt something shift inside him as he watched Victoria, not the billionaire, not the CEO, but the woman who had been abandoned by everyone except a stranger, stand up for both of them with unwavering courage. Charles looked around desperately, realizing that his carefully orchestrated intervention was collapsing. You're making a mistake, Victoria. When this goes wrong, when he takes advantage of you, don't come crying to family. I won't have to, Victoria replied calmly, because I'll have Marcus. The simplicity of that statement, the absolute trust it conveyed, hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his life, no one except his late wife had ever expressed such complete faith in him. All right, Charles said, his voice tight with rage. Have it your way. But this isn't over. The board of directors will hear about this. The shareholders, the media. We'll see how long your empire survives when everyone knows you're being manipulated by some nobody with a hard luck story. Marcus stepped forward, placing himself squarely between Charles and Victoria. Let me save you some research, Marcus said quietly. Marcus Chen, 32, widower, single father, high school graduate, no college, 2 years community service for a stupid mistake when I was 18, 3 jobs in 5 years before my wife got sick, 6 jobs in 3 years after she died. Current annual income, $28,000. He paused, looking Charles directly in the eye. Everything you need to destroy me is public record. But here's what you won't find in any file. I've never once in my life abandoned someone who needed me. I've never chosen money over loyalty, and I've never mistaken cruelty for strength. Charles's face was purple with fury. We'll see how noble you feel when you're bankrupt from legal fees. Charles, Victoria said, her voice cutting through the night air like a blade. Get off my property. Now. The convoy of black SUVs departed 15 minutes later, leaving Marcus and Victoria alone in the circular driveway. The night air was cold, and Victoria was shivering despite her robe. Let's go inside, Marcus said, gently. They made their way slowly into the mansion, Victoria leaning heavily on her walker after the physical and emotional exertion of the confrontation. In the warm light of her living room, Marcus could see how much the ordeal had cost her. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly. Are you all right? He asked. Victoria lowered herself carefully onto the sofa. I should be asking you that. Charles meant every word he said. He's going to try to destroy you. Marcus sat down across from her. Let him try. I'm not the one with something to hide. You have Emma to think about. And yourself. You could lose your job, your apartment. Charles has connections everywhere. He could make sure you never work in this city again. Marcus leaned forward, his voice steady. Victoria, 3 weeks ago, you were dying alone because the people who were supposed to love you decided you were worth more dead than alive. Tonight, those same people tried to have you declared mentally incompetent so they could control your life's work. If you think I'm going to abandon you because some rich bully threatens me, then you don't know me very well. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. I've put you in an impossible position. No. Marcus said firmly. "You've given me the chance to stand up for what's right. That's not a burden. It's a gift." Victoria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What happens now?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Now, we figure out how to protect what you've built from the people who want to tear it down. And we do it the right way. With truth, with dignity, and with the knowledge that we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves." "Together?" Victoria asked. Marcus reached across the space between them and took her hand, the same hand he had held in that hospital room when she was fighting for her life. "Together," he confirmed. Outside, the night was quiet, but both of them knew that by morning the real battle would begin. Charles Sterling would not give up easily, and the forces arrayed against them were formidable. But in that living room, surrounded by the evidence of Victoria's extraordinary life, Marcus Chen made a promise that would change both their futures forever. No matter what came next, no matter how powerful their enemies or how steep the odds, he would not let Victoria Sterling face this fight alone. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't fought for money or power or fame. Sometimes they're fought for the simple right to choose who you trust, who you love, and who you allow to stand beside you when everything else falls away. And sometimes the most unlikely people become the most loyal allies, not because of what they have to gain, but because of who they choose to be when it matters most. If you've been hooked on this incredible journey of courage, loyalty, and standing up against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that real heroes don't always wear suits. Sometimes they wear work uniforms and carry mop buckets, but they carry something much more valuable: unshakable integrity. The final confrontation between Marcus, Victoria, and the forces trying to tear them apart is coming, and you won't want to miss how this extraordinary story of friendship triumphing over greed reaches its powerful conclusion. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.